National Maple Market Development and Policy. I'm excited to give this presentation. There's been a lot of activity that I've been involved in over the past, let me say, 12 to 15 months. And there are definitely people, I think, on this meeting tonight, and certainly people at the different organizations that have maybe been active in these conversations for a lot longer than I have. So I'm going to basically share with you the efforts that I'm involved in right now through a working group with the International Maple Syrup Institute and how it connects to this bigger opportunity / question about a national maple market development program and just the different policy implications that are out there as it relates to maple and promotion. You folks have probably seen this website before. Definitely want to make people aware of that. That's where all the registrations are, and we've been adding resources. I know that Mark Iselhart has a number of maple sugar bush videos that should be going on to YouTube in the next couple days if they're not there already. And I think there'll be some links either on this maplemanager.org site or through the UVM Extension Maple website. Okay, tonight's the 14th. We got a couple more sessions. Next week, I'll do a presentation on maple financial planning and profitability. And then we're going to have a week gap on Wednesday, October 5th. Chris Lindgren is going to give a presentation on SAP business models for those that are just producing SAP and then transferring the SAP to another maple business. An overview of what's coming on tonight. It's not going to pop up. Here's the outlook for the next hour. I'm going to give a little bit of maple marketing history, very little, but just put some things in historical context. Also give a little overview of a couple of the agricultural policy laws that relate to this topic area of market development. Quick look at current market research, projects that have become available to the public. And then at that point, I'm really going to transition and talk about this process that I've been involved in with the International Maple Syrup Institute, an active sustainable funding committee looking at market development. And that'll lead us into a little bit more information on different governance frameworks for this concept of collective marketing, and it can be in a couple different formats. I'll just say that by no means is this presentation meant to decide or advocate for a particular action. I've talked to a lot of maple producers on and off and producer associations, and this is a theme that's coming up. People are asking this question of, could there be some collective maple market development programs? How would that happen? What would it look like? And so this presentation is intended really to get some awareness up, some of the different features and the concepts, and hopefully get a little discussion going. Hopefully by 7:45, 7:50, we can open up the mic and get people's feedback on it. Okay, so just a tradition of promotion. Certainly maple has been an iconic product in different ways over the past couple centuries. And I'm going to be speaking predominantly from a U.S. perspective. Definitely back in the 1800s when maple syrup reached its highest level of production in the U.S., it was definitely considered more of a utility product, not quite the specialty product it is today. For those of you that have looked at any of the statistics, you'll know that U.S. maple production peaked somewhere in the 1860s to the 1890s. I found this fact that it's estimated based on population at the time that the U.S. per capita consumption was around 28 ounces during those periods. So that's just shy of 2 pounds per person or per capita. A couple quotes I think are real interesting, and some of you have seen these in the maple history books, especially around the Civil War era. There was a connection, kind of a patriotic theme about keeping to domestic sweeteners. So there's this quote, "Make your own sugar and send not to the Indies for it. Feast not on the toil, pain, and misery of the wretched." I don't really want to get into a conversation on slavery, but I do want to make a note that when we start talking about an industry and promotion, communication and efforts like this are in that world of driving consumption, driving markets toward a particular group of products. An unfortunate time in global history here, and it was directing people back towards maple. This other quote I'm always fascinated by, "Open kettle maple syrup," and that comes from a UVM Extension Experiment Station report in 1905, and there's context on that in the report from the writer, and the context is that basically even at that point in 1905, there were producers that wanted to make a claim to consumers about this nostalgic nature of open kettle maple syrup. I'm not exactly sure the era of when flat pans or different flue pans came into use, but I'm pretty sure from my recollection that it was related to that. And just to say that if any of you or you're involved or you've seen the promotions for wood-fired maple syrup or non-RO maple syrup, nothing wrong with the claim. Just it's not a new thing for people to be making claims, and maybe in this case, this was an idea of really pulling back to a traditional mindset, moving even back to open kettles compared to what maybe the newfangled technology was of the day. So these claims are not new. There's always modern technology, and there's maybe a prior way of doing it. I just want to emphasize that as we move from the 1860s and 1890s at peak production in the U.S., we really saw a massive drop in maple syrup production historically, maple sugar, maple syrup. And at this point, I'd say we really are in this transition or continuing to be in this transition towards a luxury specialty product, which is different dynamic than it was 100 years ago, which has implications to consumers and market development. I'd like to make a mention on grading and standards. I think often we talk about promotion, people often shift towards marketing claims and features and advertisement. I just want to emphasize, and this will relate to the USDA programs we'll talk about in a bit, the relevance of standard and grading in the concept of promotion. Standards and grading definitely, they support information flow and they improve that efficiency so people know what they're going to get. So if I can read the definition a little bit more from the USDA, standards and grading offer a means to evaluate level of quality and value. They improve information flow and they improve efficiency of transactions. Many of you recognize the recent history, shifting from the historic maple grading system to the more modern grades. Well, the 2015 standards that have been established, and the shifting from the grade A and the grade B to now our grade A's from golden down to very dark. So I just want to try to grab that concept. We're talking about everything from marketing claims and features of a product, the process of how it's made, whether it's open kettles or a steam-fired evaporator, but then also these ideas of standards and grades certainly relate to this idea of communicating to consumers and facilitating the flow of product through the marketplace. Taking a look back at U.S. food policy that's relevant here, 1902 False Branding and Marketing Act was an early phase law that was trying to remedy this issue of false origin, false claims of where something was coming from. And if you go back into the history, there were issues about state claims of different sources of potatoes and where they were coming from, trying to clean that up. That led to the 1906 Federal Food and Drugs Act, embodied some of the 1902 rules, and then it definitely went a level farther and started to specifically call out the prohibition of interstate commerce for adulterated foods, and I'll put economic adulterated foods. Maple is definitely in the history and related to the evolution of this law, the concept of cutting maple syrup with cheaper sucrose, cheaper sugar options that could be, I guess, less easy to identify. So the concept of economic adulteration, not to say contaminate something, but to do something to change the cost of the good and potentially still chase a premium in the marketplace. And then these drugs have certainly been adapted and evolved, and then 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act continued to build upon these rules. So I wanted to point out origin and adulteration, and maple being relevant to these historic national policy laws. Then we get to 1922, the Capper-Volstead Act. This is relevant for our conversation on collective marketing. So in 1922, this act was passed, and it gave agricultural producers and their associations basically the ability to act together, and it gave them this exemption or limited exemption from what we consider antitrust rules. That meaning that producers could get together and discuss things about the marketplace, discuss things about price, and not fall afoul of the law. So the 22 Capper-Volstead Act does something really important for agricultural producers in saying, yes, you can work together. Individual producers can band together in associations, and multiple associations can band together. And it won't be considered collusion if you work together to discuss the dynamics of marketing, expansion, even production and pricing. Another feature of the Volstead Act is this concept of consumer protection. It's a little vague, and I'm not an ag policy expert just yet, but there are clauses that protect consumers from undue price enhancements that result from monopoly positions. So it's, I think, subjective the way I understand it, but I'm sure there's laws or court cases historically that have looked at when producer groups have actually been in the right in saying they're discussing pricing and supply, and when potentially those decisions could cause undue stress on consumers, and there is a line there that could be crossed that could say maybe they've gone too far. Another historical marketing agreement, 1937 Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act. This is going to be relevant. This is basically the formative law that will lead us to maybe 15 minutes from now when I start talking about the agricultural marketing service programs we've been looking at. In 1937, this act provided the authority for federal marketing orders and marketing agreements. So at the time, this is New Deal era, and at the time coming off of or within the Depression period, there was a situation of large agricultural surpluses in the United States, also declining foreign markets, and kind of a whole host of pricing and distribution problems. And this was put into the toolbox as a mechanism for industries to be able to, agricultural industries, to be able to enact these agreements to do something like what the Capper-Volstead Act said, basically to work together and to strategize on the dynamics of supply, demand, price, and a few other things we'll get into today. It's a pretty quick walk down memory lane there. So leading from that history in the early 1900s into 2022 today, but in 2021, the International Maple Syrup Institute established the Sustainable Funding Committee. So what were the goals? What were the goals of this committee? To investigate frameworks for funding the promotion and marketing of primarily pure maple syrup. The committee, based on producers and industry leaders in manufacturing, packaging, and distribution, wanted to advance the investigation of this concept of a self-funded mechanism, meaning that the funding is coming from the producers themselves. I'll leave that there. So a self-funded mechanism. I just want to note the committee, as we've got some members here. I was invited to join the committee. We've got some on the call tonight. At least 6 states. In case I've missed somebody, we've got producers, we've got syrup buyers, maple distributors, and equipment dealers discussing this concept. And as I said earlier, this presentation and hopefully discussions, a lot about awareness and dialogue. In this group alone, we've had so many opinions, great ideas, great input, and contention on this concept of collective marketing within the United States. By no means is it a foregone conclusion about how it will happen, but the one thing that I think sticks everyone on this committee together is the belief that this is worth investigating. This is worth exploring. Is there a mechanism that we can enhance our market presence in the maple community or for the maple community? So what are the rationale of this committee in general? Advances in technology, expansion of maple taps in the US and Canada, an increase in annual maple crops. This is a reality, and you can all see that from the statistics, and you know that probably from your business and your peers. We've got more maple syrup out there generally, and we continue to hit record crops. There's a desire to ensure market development and market expansion occur at pace with the increase in maple syrup supply. We can all look at other agricultural specialty crops and commodities. In Vermont, we're very keen on looking at the dairy industry, and we're very attuned to what the concept of oversupply means for pricing and what price volatility means for producer livelihood. So this committee and this charge is definitely based on this concept of we need to be active as an industry looking at market development, especially if production and volume is going to increase. And we recognize the balance of demand and pricing, this whole concept that market development and promoting demand potentially has impact to either elevate prices or at least stabilize prices or prevent pricing shocks. So looking at the U.S. maple situation a little bit more, we know that the United States is the largest market for maple syrup globally. The majority of the syrup on the globe is produced in Quebec, and a good deal of that is exported from Quebec, imported into the United States. Roughly 60-40 Canada, US syrup makes up the US domestic supply, and I think that number has been coming closer to 50-50, so it may be something like 55% Canadian syrup to 45% American syrup that makes up the US consumption. So we know we have an increasing supply domestically as the US production grows. And there's also the recognition of the PPAQ, the Quebec Maple Producers Association, that they have been operating with an evolving market management system that's included promotional efforts. We've also have learned, some of you may know directly, I hear through the grapevine, that the PPAQ has been investing generic promotion into the United States to prop up this market development. And there's serious considerations about how those priorities from the PPAQ potentially will shift or have been shifting as other global markets potentially show growth opportunity as well. I've got a question from Nick. Is there a strong difference in U.S. consumption by state or relatively equal? You know, in a couple of minutes, Nick, I'm going to pull up some new market research that's been available. I won't be able to answer that question. I'm going to say, just off the cuff here, from talking to people, leaders in the maple industry, I'd say there is definitely strong consumption in the traditional maple producing regions of New England and the northern Midwest. We can expect higher consumption rates. I got to see if the market research would bear that out. I think there's also a collective understanding that there's huge opportunities and priorities about expanding demand in the non-maple producing regions. So the other states of the United States and the Southeast and Southwest and far West, an awareness to be intentional about getting product into those marketplaces, especially in some of the local regions here where people are really experiencing strong competition in the marketplace, trying to sell syrup locally. I want to look over on the right-hand side. Another rationale for considering these options of market development. 2020 report out of Quebec looked at per capita consumption. This is in kilograms, so I'm not going to do conversions. The all Canada per capita maple syrup consumption in 2020 was 0.62 kilograms. Look at the U.S. All U.S. per capita consumption estimated at 0.16 kilograms per capita, and then look at the Quebec per capita consumption, 1.4 kilograms per capita in Quebec in 2020. I don't have the honey stat up here. I may reference honey as the presentation goes on. Honey is, I would say a direct substitute in the sense that it's a premium specialty sweetener, more on the natural, lightly processed side that maple definitely competes with. And I can't tell you the number, but that report's got the honey consumption, and it's definitely higher. Oh, thanks, Arnie. 35 ounces in a kilogram. So point of reference there, if it's 35 ounces in a kilogram and the US consumption right now is 0.16 kilograms, I think that earlier 1860s stat had us at somewhere around 28 ounces of per capita consumption in the US. So how do I say this? I don't know if we can say that maple markets are falling apart at all, and we don't want to say that. But when you look at a chart like this and you say, what would happen if the all US per capita maple consumption quadrupled to get to the all Canada number around a little around a half a kilogram? What would that mean for prices? What would that mean for maple syrup movement? These are the questions that I think this project is trying to get at. There we go. Okay, Nick hit us, right? Looks like the honey consumption could be at 1.8 pounds per person and U.S. maple syrup consumption still almost a quarter of a pound, 0.25 pounds per person compared to honey at 1.8. So the question is, well, what are we doing? We seem to be moving our annual crop here, but are we actually moving the market in the direction that our competitors are moving the market? Whether it's competitors moving syrup in other locales, or if it's a competing product like honey, and they could potentially be on a positive growth trajectory for per capita consumption. So more numbers from that Canadian report. Canada consumption up 42% from 2016 to 2020, up 42% growth. United States up 18%. That's not a bad number. Positive 18% growth is good. But again, the head scratcher, why is Canadian consumption up 42 and why are we only up 18? Are we leaving something on the table there? And I mentioned this earlier, I do think there's a lot of recognition that U.S. growth outlook could be very strong as we move out of non-maple producing regions. That's not to mean it's a slam dunk. There's a lot of cultural distinctions and sweetener preferences, but I do think there's a kind of a bullish mentality that if we can get this product in those other regions, we could definitely see some more growth. The question came up about consumption in other states, and I would say this is the place to go. I can't click in there while I'm presenting, but specifically the second bullet there, the Maple Maps. This is available. I think if you Google, maybe before we end, I'll try to find it and put it in the chat, or if anyone's double tasking and can type in maplemaps.gitlab. I think that's the server or one of the addresses. This came out of the University of Southern Maine in cooperation with the Atlantic Corporation, kind of a very interactive mapping option. And there's a number of different things on preferences and consumption. Good, it's popping up in the chat. So this would be to answer that earlier question about state consumption. I don't know if we'll see it in per capita or if we'll see it maybe in dollar value purchases. So I'd encourage maybe someone to check that out. So we've got that Maple Maps and that link popped up. The other one that came up definitely over a year and a half ago, the Vermont Maple Data Dashboard, another interactive one based on research, again with the Atlantic Corp and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, looking at different consumer preferences and starting to disentangle, like, where are the features, what's the packaging, where are the sales of maple coming from. I don't have a site and I don't know if it's published yet, but I just want to reference the New York State Maple Producer Association. Helen Thomas has been recently presenting on consumer demand research and results that they've been developing. They're midway through a project. And the one thing that I heard from looking at one of the presentation notes was what they're finding is there's a lot of there's some people that are committed to syrup, and if I say this right, there's a number of consumers out there that actually aren't able to accurately identify pure maple syrup as something different from what we'll call the corn syrup-based table syrups, like the log cabins. So really important research there that indicates that yes, there are some really loyal maple supporters, but there could be a large portion of the population that really does not get it yet. They have not got the educational messaging about pure maple syrup, and they're not able to identify those pure products compared to some of the other options within the grocery store. So this market research is popping up, and I just want to make sure that people are aware of it. The rest of this session, really, we're going to shift into this concept of, well, what would a collective marketing promotion look like? I think if you're a business owner, these options are really going to help you fine-tune your specific based business strategy. But these also provide the information that could inform a collective strategy from broader groups. So it's exciting to see that information coming out, and I know there'll be more results being shared. So this concept of collective promotion, the idea of multiple agricultural producers working on market development together. Definition, generic promotion. I think it's really difficult to use the word generic when we're talking about maple syrup. I've talked to a few people and they cringe at the idea, but I think it's important to emphasize when we say generic promotion, we're really talking about not this private or branded product promotion or product advertisements, but this idea of raising consumer and buyer awareness for a group of products, in this case, pure maple syrup, or a key ingredient to benefit market development for the entirety of the participants in the sector. And I think that's key. We're trying to raise awareness about a group of products, not a particular branded product. And we're trying to raise that awareness for the benefit of all the participants, meaning all the producers. So collective group puts information out there about pure maple syrup. Consumers understand pure maple syrup, and however they get back, they get back to a purchase moment, back to the private brands. But we're not talking about the private brand. Another definition that I think is important, in our committee, I think sometimes forgets to check ourselves with what we're talking about. The idea of demand here. So demand economically, the desire to own or consume something. So the goal in the context of collective market development would be to increase demand over time, to maintain price or potentially apply reasonable upward pressure on price that could sustain or enhance producer purchasing power. This was the issue in the 1920s and 30s from some of those old agricultural acts that I mentioned. Producer purchasing power was in decline because there was a surplus and prices dropped, which meant there wasn't enough money moving into the producers' pockets to enable them to run their business and, keep the rural economies uplifted. So the idea of demand is the idea of getting that desire to own or consume something up. And I want to emphasize over time. And then I'm going to flip to the next definition. So demand is increased over time. That is different than sales here. We're not talking about actual sales during a specific period of time. So the concept of sale is the transaction, right? The transaction of a good in the exchange for a dollar here. This is not talking about how to get the participant on this webinar to sell out this year. That's great. We want that to happen. This is about building the demand over time so that the marketplace is expanding. And here's the dilemma. If Arnie, I'm going to pick on Arnie. If Arnie sells out this year, that's great. That hasn't grown the market. Arnie's out of syrup. He can't sell anymore. So the idea of building demand is saying we don't want people to sell out and say, well, we can't supply anymore, we're sold out. It's the idea that you want that demand to be building and building and building as the production and supply builds as well. So we're trying to grow the market. We're not trying to empty the warehouse and be done. We're trying to build them to over time. Another definition that's worth mentioning here, advertisement. Communication to persuade or motivate consumers to purchase now, right? We're not talking about advertising in these programs. We're talking again about generic promotion. How do we lift up demand that's going to benefit the entirety of the participants in the sector, not a particular company, not a particular label? Yeah, Got Milk. Darren's Got Milk's an example, and I'm going to give you a couple more industries in a second here of agricultural sectors that have moved forward. So our group got together, we had this rationale, right? We've been having these meetings and then we're talking about, well, what do we see out there? So what are the other sectors doing in the United States? I got three buckets here. We've got a group of crops that we've investigated that are working within the USDA market order or research and promotion program framework on the left. In the middle, we've got some cooperatives. And on the right, we've got this one unique model. So I'm just going to mention these, and when we get to discussion, we maybe could pick at a few of these more. But we did look at honey. We looked at beef. We looked at pecans. Pecans, one of the newer USDA market orders. Christmas trees is another newer USDA. I'm pretty sure it's a market order, and I got to check to see if it's not. It's a research and promotion program. Hazelnuts has a market order. In the US right now, there's at least 22 research and promotion programs. It's a certain type of program area, and there's 28 market orders, and they each have some different features. So we looked at these things and we thought, well, these are the industries are doing this. Going to the middle, cooperatives, right? Capper-Volstead Act, whatever that year was in the 1920s, said, hey, you all can get together and you can talk about pricing and you can talk about supply as long as it doesn't cause any undue pain on consumers. In the US, the dairy industry is very established with cooperatives. A couple other ones, Cranberry, Ocean Spray, one of the largest cooperatives in the United States. Almonds. I think it's Blue Diamond is one of the leading cooperatives, almonds and nuts. There's a number of cooperatives also that I think that I'll mention that are merged. A lot of like commodity crop and services cooperatives that are agriculturally related, but they're not particularly just to selling the agricultural products, feed, seed type cooperatives, as well as equipment and supplies. Something I want to note on cooperatives, it's another way to structure collective activity. There are buyers cooperatives. There are cooperatives that form by basically harnessing the buying power of a group of people to bring in inputs. It could be a consumer cooperative that buys in bulk, and then the buyers can then access that discount. Industries also do this as well. They create buyers cooperatives so they can get discount on heavily used items, let's say like fuel and utilities. The opposite would be a seller cooperative, where groups of people are putting in product and becoming co-owners of this business entity, and then collectively branding, marketing, distributing, inventorying product that moves out theoretically under probably a unified brand. So there's just two dimensions there to cooperatives. I think primarily we're sort of shifting towards this concept of seller cooperative with market development, but I don't want maple producers to miss on this detail of a buyer cooperative could potentially be a great source to procure inputs or services in a reduced fashion. And I know that some of the producer associations function in a way, like maybe you get discounts on insurance through your producer association. Not necessarily cooperative, but the same idea of leveraging your group. Over on the right, there was this one unique model, this seafood quality program through the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, if I've got that right, NOAA. A very different look, but this is an example of an industry that's working with a federal agency, and they're facilitating markets and trade by supporting quality standards, and all the details that allow seafood producers to label and trade and possibly export their product. And it's a fee-based program. So in some sort of collaboration with the US government, they found a way to establish a service of value and a fee structure so that people could subscribe as members and then receive these services to help them actually enhance their marketing capacity. Okay, so these are the ones we looked at here, and now I'm going to flip, I think, to some of the features of the USDA programs. Oh, important to mention here. Yes, there's a huge amount of cooperatives, dairy, almonds, and all that. A lot of those cooperatives nationally still flow into USDA agricultural marketing service, market orders, or research promotion programs. So they're not explicit and you just have a cooperative and that's it. Cooperative is definitely a private entity, a private mechanism to collectively mobilize a group of people. But in this case, a lot of these sectors still flow into these federal programs. Okay, so I mentioned the private cooperatives. I think our group has been very mindful that we may have some suspicion or some disinterest in working, quote, with a government program. So we did want to look at the private cooperatives as an option. Voluntary programs, historically, there have been a lot more voluntary programs. What we've learned from talking to agencies, regional and federal, is that a number of the voluntary programs have actually either dismantled or they've converted into mandatory programs at the federal level, generally because of the free rider issue. There were checkoff programs regionally that potentially were successful at one point in time, but they've just had so much trouble being that they're voluntary and had so many participants in that sector not actually opt in and not make contributions that the programs failed more or less. So they said it's very rare to see a successful and viable voluntary collective program, which leads us to this third bullet there, the USDA Ag Marketing Service, the governed agreements and orders. So I'm going to dig into those a little bit more and talk about the features. On the right here, great picture. Some of us were at the IMSI annual meeting in Essex Junction, Vermont this June. And one of the representatives from the PPAQ in Quebec showed us some examples of some of their generic promotions. I if I understand this, I think these are maybe sample boxes that are possibly going overseas and maybe going to key people like chefs or cooking schools. This is a great example of generic promotion, right? This is not a branded product. This is not a sale. This is not leading anyone to a particular company. This is promoting pure maple syrup from Canada. And they've got some features there, one ingredient, one delicious flavor, and they're moving the awareness forward in that way with the assumption that enough activity could then draw people to make their purchasing transaction. So a nice example of some of the PPA, more recent PPAQ campaigns, I think that's active. So I want to dig into this idea of market orders and research and promotion programs, help people become aware of what they look like and how they're structured. So participation, they're mandatory programs, right? The idea is these are not voluntary programs with people deciding if they're in or out. These are programs that when they're established, they're mandatory for those that will say are, quote, covered. And there are exemptions. So the build out of any program would specifically identify who would be exempt, and I'll talk about that in a second. But mandatory, binding programs once they're established, if they're established. They have a specified geographic coverage. It can be broad, being national, or it could be specific, like the hazelnut market order is all of Oregon, and I think a couple counties or regions in the state of Washington that embody the bulk of the U.S. hazelnut production. That's under a market order, but they draw the line, and they can cross state lines, and they can cut states in half if they need to. Other main feature that an assessment is collected. I think from our experience looking at these different industries, you're looking at roughly 1 to 3% of the value of the product at the wholesale level or whatever the initial transaction is. So an example of the PPAQ, the portion of their assessments that are specifically for marketing and promotion, I think we're thinking 6.5 or maybe 7 cents on a pound of syrup Canadian is what the assessment is in Quebec right now. They have a number of other assessments as well. And we looked at that for honey, potatoes, Christmas trees, and things like that. And, 1 to 5%, and definitely closer, probably 1 to 3% of the value of the product could be the assessment. An example would be Christmas trees. Could be $15 a tree. The beef checkoff for a while, I think it was a certain dollar per head. Okay, what's the activity of the program? Ideally, generic promotion, like we've discussed. Research and development, definitely people looking at different varietals, genomics, especially say in the apple or in hazelnuts, they're looking at resistance, insect protection, things like that. Quality regulations and standards, as we mentioned, those can be encompassed into a governing framework to establish uniform standards. Maple certainly has those standards now. Not every industry had them historically. Quantity regulation is an option, particularly in the market orders. The market orders do allow for a measurement and a determination of how much supply, how much and when and in what form, especially for different grades. Import regulations, also an option in these programs. There is the potential to consider what happens for product moving into the U.S. marketplace from other countries. It could be assessed, and there could be different parameters in the regulations of how to handle that product coming in. Governance. This is, I think, worth noting. A lot of people have said we want to investigate self-funding within the maple industry. We don't want a government program. These orders are under government rule in the sense that the government framework is there and the legality is there. It's made available through those acts I talked about earlier to say you can work together as a group, and there's a structure and process. The boards, however, are based on the covered members again. So these are not necessarily government decisions. And what we've learned from talking to ag marketing service people is the boards are often based on membership, and voting representation very often reflects the member contribution. So the beef promotional council, for example, different voting based on the states and the quantity of beef that they produce, either historically or on running averages. Different votes get dealt out based on how much product they're putting into the order and through product, meaning how much money are they putting into the order. There definitely is USDA review on the activity of the promotion boards to make sure that the communications, promotional campaigns, language, all of that has to be legal within the statutes that enable these things to actually happen. So there is a USDA review process, but the governance is very much appointed or volunteer. I'm sorry, I actually don't know if they're paid or not. I want to say representatives within the industry. So the producers, packers, distributors are very much at the table if they're covered by the order. Another feature here is exemptions. In all the market orders and promotion programs we've looked at, they all have a different rationale for creating exemptions from people that participate in their sector, but it's been decided that that's not the type of producer or the amount of product that we want to include and assess. So this is going to vary by sector and program. Very often it's by scale of producer, either the volume of the producer, how many thousands of pounds they sell in a year, or there could be a sales cap that we've seen in some of these examples. Let's say a business that's got less than $20,000 in sales could be just explicitly exempt. Market channel of sale is also something that could be an exemption. With hazelnuts, the assessments all happen at the shelling facilities, as I understand, if I've got that right. So if you're actually selling hazelnuts online or you're doing any direct sale, you're going to be potentially exempt. But if you're moving your nuts through a facility for shelling and then they're moving through to a distributor co-op, there may be an assessment there. So the direction of the product could create a mechanism for exemption. And then, as I mentioned with these programs, there certainly is the decision to cover domestic product only, or in some cases to explore the imports coming into the U.S. marketplace, whether they would be assessed or whether they would be subject to quantity and volume amounts coming in and out of the marketplace. A lot of tools here, and it's really up to the governing law that gets established of what that program would look like for maple, just as it has for pecans and Christmas trees and honey. Moving backwards here, just a little bit on establishment here. If the maple industry were to look at something like this, there's a process of creating an industry program feasibility plan, combination of market research, confirmation that the participants in the industry think it's a worthwhile endeavor. It can't just come from nowhere, and the USDA does its due diligence to make sure that it has a reasonable potential to be viable financially, the way it's designed, and that people are behind it. There's a hearing process, review process, comment period that could take, months, if not years. And then eventually there's a referendum vote that would go to the people that would, only the people that would be covered under the proposed order would actually be voting on it. So this comes back in, I think, to the exemption clauses. So that is there's quite a process to work through these as well. This is a very different process than, say, creating a private cooperative entity and working within a group of people and creating a framework that way. So I'm going to close off here before I open up for conversation and just mention one thing. As we've investigated these USDA programs, this very important dilemma comes up, the organic maple syrup dilemma. I've got to check the information to figure out if I know the status, but at one point there was a pending organic market order, a general market order for organic products across milk, vegetables, maple. And because there was a pending organic market order, organic producers still do legally have the option to self-exempt from any AMS market agreements or market orders. Now, in other industries, this maybe is not such an issue because organic production is a smaller fraction, let's say less than 20% of domestic supply. But at this point right now, US syrup, we're estimating, is got to be 50, 60, maybe plus 60% certified organic within our US domestic supply. It would certainly be viable if every organic producer were to say, oh, I'm in on a program like this. I will voluntarily contribute, but it's important to know that right now, as the law is, there is this organic maple issue where producers could opt out. I think what's happening is if this other market order does succeed, producers can't be double assessed. You can't be assessed by the organic market order and then have a maple producer then be assessed through the maple market order. And I think the producers again would kind of have the option which one they might put into. This is a big sticking point right now. We haven't gotten into the next level of what could change legally, but we know that it is a dilemma. So I'm just going to go to the chat box here and see if I've got anything, and that may be it for slides. Question from Matt. Are you saying that the International Maple Syrup Producers Association is looking into this? Yeah, so right now there's an active committee looking at sustainable funding, and really our task was to investigate all the different frameworks. When we first started, we had 4 people that said, we only want to see a voluntary framework happen. And then a few other people said, well, we've looked at a voluntary framework and we don't think that's going to work. So we've actually been, as a group, kind of going through the process of looking at different industries, having conversations about the frameworks. So yes, we're looking at this concept of what could happen collectively within the US, in addition to the good stuff that's happening now. And we're looking at all these different options, having conversations like tonight to share a little bit of what we learned and also get people's feedback. Reading back here, Arnie says 3.5% of U.S. milk is organic. Great. That's a little different than 60%, right? So if the organic producers opt out, not a big deal for the Got Milk campaign. I'm going to scan through. Let me see if I got. Oh yeah, ongoing research. Just to say that we're doing some research on this now. I'm going to get back into the chat window here, and if anyone wants to unmute, feel free, and we'd love to hear opinions here. I think that's one thing we want to emphasize. We've heard a lot of opinions in our committee here. We've kept it very friendly, and it's been fantastic because this concept of collective effort, I won't say what it pushes on. You may know, but it pushes on some things that people take seriously. So let me see. Nick says difference between a market order and an RMP program. The way it's been explained to me, market orders are pretty complicated. The research and promotion programs are a lot cleaner. Limited tools in a research and promotion program, but as our committee, I'd say would assume that the research and promotion program seems a lot more fitting for Maple in the sense that it offers a mechanism to create an assessment structure and focus it on research and promotional activity to develop the market. The market orders have lots of other features like establishment of standards. Already been done for Maple. We don't need a program that does new standards establishment. But a market order could include establishment issues. The market order, I believe, also does have production curtailment, call it quota, call it supply management mechanisms in it. That's something that's different than what the RMP programs allow. So market orders, much more complicated, many more tools there. The research and promotion one is much more of let's collect money, let's advance primary research, market research, and generic promotion. Let's see, Stu, are you estimating that 50 to 60% of US maple production is organic? Seems really high. Well, what do you all think? I don't have the NASS stats in front of me. There's been some periodic organic production calculations, also been some issues with NASS. We did a survey in 2019 across the Northeast, and we hit, I think, 61% of the crop in the survey was certified organic. And all I can say is I've mentioned this in the eyes of a couple major packers in the U.S., and I've gotten them to nod in group environments and said, yeah, that's not too far off. What we do know about this is this 50 or 60% of the U.S. crop, if it's organic, it's not coming from the majority of the producers. This could be coming from 10 to 15% of the maple producers as we know it, and that 10 or 15% of those producers, very likely the producers that are exclusively 20, 40, 50, 100,000 tap operations. So the volume of the crop is not reflective of the number of producers because of the scale. A lot of the larger enterprises have gone organic. But please speak up if anyone has contention, because we don't have a lot of information on this. We're really early on in researching these dynamics for maple. Could
Darren.
possibly, yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Darren.
this is Darren. And it seems like a lot of the, pretty much every new sugar bush that's coming in Wisconsin, at least in my area, is going organic because the state is subsidizing the certification process, and they're getting a premium on their syrup.
Okay, okay. There's an incentive. Matt, question, and this could possibly become mandatory. So Matt, you know, the couple different things on the table just this evening, we certainly got the USDA programs as they're established. Those are binding mandatory programs given the exemptions that I discussed. And every active program has a long list of exemptions where participants don't contribute because they're not deemed to be the target for the market development. But cooperatives, let's say, you know, these private mechanisms do exist, and those aren't mandatory at all. Those are independently governed corporations, a group of member owners. So we're trying to kind of keep that open and understand we've got private, and then we've got these USDA mandatory programs. Great question. You know, I think that pushes at the heart of it. I'm doing interviews right now, and I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, I'd contribute just because I want to contribute to the group. And I've heard other people say, no, I'm doing this on my own. I don't want to be a part of it. So we're not naive to the fact that starts to, it changes people's worldview a little bit, especially as you talk to people in Canada. Folks in Canada definitely have a different perception, different culture when it comes to collective agricultural units. Hit the chat, speak up, and just as the ongoing research. So as part of this IMSI committee, we're investigating the market dynamics in general. And some of you may hear from me. We are going to be putting out an invitation. I've started to do private interviews with people, basically to get that feedback of what does this concept sound like to you? What are the features of collective promotion that you think are important for the future of U.S. maple? What are the features that you're not so keen on? Yeah, and yeah, dairy, I love it. Yeah, go ahead, whoever's speaking, and then we'll get to the comment about dairy.
Yeah, well, that's part of what I was going to say. This is Darren again. So yeah, there's dairy is the cooperatives in dairy have a lot of power, to the point where they're vertically integrating now, and there's a big concern when they're starting to get into their own brands and such. Same thing with cranberry, with Ocean Spray and so forth. And how is there concern about any kind of creep in some of these programs, or moving from just a marketing um, you know plan to something that's much more in depth and embedded in the whole industry vertically?
Right. Good question. One thing I'll say from my investigation, well, let's look at the Quebec example. Speak up if anyone on the line is from Quebec. Quebec's maple market management program is not where it was 40 years ago. That program has evolved, and then they have added features and different dynamics to that program. So these programs definitely are likely to evolve. With reference to USDA research and promotion programs, one of the things we're researching right now is there are promotional programs that have been, I don't know what the term is, terminated, right? So you've got an active board that's implementing a program based on the design that they saw fit for their industry, and they are subject to, I don't know if they're subject to regular renewal or if there's an option to sort of call question to the validity of the program. And there are examples of programs that were established and have been voted out. So I just want to mention that there is a mechanism for programs to be terminated, and that does happen. This idea of vertical integration, I don't want to get, I don't know how to get too into that, because I do know, like the dairy example, those are cooperatives that are functioning separately that relate to the market order. We definitely don't have that cooperative momentum in US maple at all yet. So I think it is a bit of a different beast. But the point on dairy is super relevant. And I have talked to people and they've said, well, this concept actually sounds pretty good, but good luck getting this off the ground with anybody that's got experience with dairy, because the pricing and the dynamics of the dairy industry have they don't become a huge success story for something like this. And I get it. And the counterpoint I'll say, as the person with the mic right now, is dairy is an extremely perishable product. Fluid milk is an extremely perishable product. Maple doesn't last forever, but I would say it's a significantly different product format. So I'd be looking at some other examples of market orders and research and promotion programs like honey, for example. Maybe look at olive oil and other industries like that that are semi-shelf stable for a period of time, and look to see what kind of traction those programs have had, given that dairy is such a different beast. But I think point taken.
Well, that goes
Definitely.
back, I mean, to your first slide, I think, where maple is a luxury, whereas dairy is very much a grocery store. It is similar to gasoline or any other commodity. It's very much about price based, because it's something that's considered a standard supermarket commodity as opposed to luxury. Whereas olive oil or cranberries or almonds.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and there's no guarantee on this, for sure. But I think that's the kind of stuff I think we're trying to, we're looking at it. We're having this conversation tonight just to see what bugs people and what's, let's go back to that per capita consumption figure and say, is there a reason we're at 0.16 kilograms per person in the U.S.? Like, from a nutrition standpoint, maybe that's a good place to be. Or is there an opportunity for something different?
So, Mark, who's going to run it?
Run what?
Well, if we're looking at this co-op kind of thing, there's somebody at the top who runs it. So who's going to be? All co-ops have a committee at the top. Who's going to be that committee at the top?
Well, if we're mentioning, I mean, a cooperative is a private business entity made on member owners. So we'd be waiting to see what maple producers decided that they wanted to invest equity and go in on a cooperative. And I would say that a cooperative is going to have a board of directors based on who joins that cooperative. Cooperative would be completely voluntary, because that's not a mandatory program. So, Matt, I don't know. I'm not sure. I know there's a couple smaller cooperatives regionally here. I don't know if the maple industry has an appetite for a large cooperative. Haven't seen it yet.
Be terming it incorrectly. If it becomes the government mandated.
Right. Yeah.
Who runs?
So, the different active USDA, let's call them the AMS market agreements that are in place for other commodities, they are run by boards, and the boards are built with people with voting rights on those boards that are the included participants, the contributors. So those that pay into the programs become the participants, and they are then built into the boards. And I can't explain to you right offhand how those members are appointed. I don't know if it would be a progression through, say, state producer associations. I'm not exactly sure how the delegates get selected, but that is part of it. That's part of the governance framework, is to identify how would that board be built and who would be put on it. So, great question.
So I'm hoping, I'd like to expand on my question a little bit, and I'm hoping you can tell me I'm wrong. I fear that a seat on that panel can be purchased not through maple syrup, but through money. So somebody who has nothing to do with maple syrup can buy a seat and a vote on that board if it is government. And if I understand it correctly, that's the case. But I might be wrong, and I hope I am.
I'm not aware of that. The little we looked at into board makeup was that representing bodies or associations, or in this case regions, had voting delegates based on the volume of product they actually put in. So the example that we looked at was like beef, and that certain states like Vermont don't have voting members on the beef council, let's say, but Oklahoma may have a number of voting delegates compared to New Mexico, compared to I don't know how I've said it, Arizona or something like that. So yeah, I think you're getting to the heart of it, especially as we're talking about governance, is how is that structured? Here's a relevant example for Maple as it was described to me. If a Maple program under USDA frameworks went into effect in the United States, there could be an option to include imported Canadian syrup. If that was the case, the importers would potentially have a seat at the board, and it would be based on the volume of syrup that moved through. So this was a discussion that happened early on was, interesting. So if most of the syrup in the US is actually Canadian syrup that comes across the border, if we were to establish a program and divide the voting delegates based on volume, there could be more voting power in the hands of importers. At that particular time, I think a lot of people said, I don't know if that's the direction we want to go with this. So there's a definite, the structure of the programs, I think, relate to your question of who gets on the voting board. And I don't know the specifics, that idea of if there are appointees and how that happens. I think there's a certain amount of, I got to assume there's some politicking if they're state representatives. I don't know if there's mechanics in the statutes of how the USDA has to let that be navigated. So great question. Terrific question. Good. Active chat. I'm willing to stay on for a couple minutes. If anyone's got to get off, feel free to get off. Let's just go for like another 5 minutes max here, and we'll see. Dairy comments. How does PPAQ or honey marketer protect the small producer? Nick, great question. I think the idea of protect is a little bit, subjective here, because I don't know if these, in the case of honey, I don't know where the exemptions are. So I don't know if honey has small producers that actually are required to pay assessments in, or if they're exempted. But I think scale is always relevant. In our discussions, I think a lot of people have assumed there's some cutoff for maple of small scale producers where there's just not enough syrup coming from smaller producers to try to like disenfranchise them with an assessment. If they're selling syrup from their dooryard, as an example, and they're doing their own marketing promotion, they're selling syrup. We're not really trying to pull them into assessments to grow demand. But then when we mention the 70,000 tap maple, organic maple operation, that's maybe putting it all in bulk barrels, and we think that may be a target that's a syrup that could benefit from market growth. So not a great answer there.
So the purpose of this, I'm sorry, Mark, I'm not interrupting anybody else, am I?
No, go for it. We got it. Yeah.
So the purpose of this is to develop the expansion of maple, of syrup.
Not production. Production is getting expanded on its own. The idea of we're investigating collective market development programs to do two things. To say, we want to make sure that the market demand for syrup grows, and the idea of it being collective, I think, also is saying, yes, there may be state and local promotion programs, but there may be a reason for there to be something broader to encompass all of U.S. efforts, given the dynamics of the market changing. So trying to grow markets for maple.
So what happens if the market grows and we have a year like last year where the reserve went to, what was it, 2 million pounds of table grade syrup?
Mm-hmm.
And we just grew a market and now we can't meet demand?
No, I think you raise a great point. This is the dynamic of, do you mediate those ups and downs? Do you have to kind of ride with them? In this case, the reason the market wasn't extremely interrupted was because the PPAQ has a market management program with an inventory program, right? What would have happened if the PPAQ did not have a strategic reserve? I don't know of one in the US.
Well, in the US, it's at Bascom's and Anderson's and all of the major housing places or syrup buyers. But I don't know how they did. Maybe they were maybe they were buying from Quebec.
Great question. I mean, yeah, you don't want to grow markets faster than they can be served. There's a balance there. I'm going to hit the chat again here. Arnie, 55% of Christmas tree growers voted in 19 to continue their program. So the program, even though the program was showing good ROI. So there's an example that the vote came up again for Christmas tree. It's a relatively new program showing good results, and 55% said, yeah, we want it. Close to being voted out. Darren says, would a market order inhibit local, state, or regional marketing? No, I don't think so. I think there's a big question of, you know, what would a market order do? What would the generic message be? There are definitely instances right now where some of the national market orders and promotion boards have sort of an interaction with state-based associations, and I think there's even some fund sharing that gets put into it. So I think there are different ways to go about that, and I don't think it's an either or. I think there's an and thing going where there's still state promotion happening. And then there is the recognition for some of the products where they've said, hey, state origin doesn't matter to someone in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So we're not going to bother calling it New England beef. It's just beef. So there's the beef promotion saying we're gonna go generic here. We don't need, they don't care what state it comes from. That's very different than someone, say, in Ohio, wanted to do like an Ohio maple promotion.
You're from Vermont, right?
I live in Vermont. I'm from Syracuse, New York.
Okay. Well, I just, it puzzled me when you said somebody from Vermont is not worried about what state maple syrup comes from. Sorry, had to pick.
Well, no, I'll say that quite clearly. I work with a lot of Vermont producers, and they're saying we get our syrup into other markets, other metro markets across the U.S. And there is conversation. They're saying they don't care if it's from Vermont. They want high quality maple syrup. And there are some people in other parts of the country, they don't know the difference between Vermont and New Hampshire. And I think that's the importance of market research, is that for maple producers, there's a certain ethic or an idea. And that's not to say Vermont doesn't have cachet. I know it does. Historically, it has. I do know from talking to packers, Vermont doesn't have a premium on shelves anymore, payment premium. It may make someone decide to buy syrup from Vermont, but the price premium isn't there anymore. And I think this is where we get at the dynamics. Is the market today the same market it was 20 years ago? And you know, I think it's changing. Let's get one more here. Stu, I have not heard anything that suggests government mandated. The question is, what, if anything, maple producers want to do to promote marketing? Yeah, I mean, I think that's the general question here. You know, are producers going to continue to work independently? Nothing wrong with that. Packers are certainly doing a great job moving record crops. So we're not saying the system is broken, but there's a lot of people that look at that per capita stat and they say, I don't know, could we do better? Could we pool resources? Open question. Yep, Darren makes a good product. Good point. Different product forms. Maple syrup as a table grade is different than value added. It's different than ingredients in food products. A lot to peel away. Well, I want to wrap up. I really appreciate the folks that stuck on a little bit longer, but I want to respect everyone's time. And what I will say is, for those of you on, if you have any really strong opinions and you want to follow up with me, please send me an email, Mark Cannella, mark.cannella@uvm.edu, and you can find it online. We are looking at potentially another year of research to get people's input on this, and I think it's great to hear points, counterpoints. What about the dairy? This scares me. Even the comments here really gives us a good understanding of what it means for people to think about this idea of promotion. And I'll also ask you questions about what do people feel about not knowing where prices are going to be, because that's part of the dynamic as well, of, you know, price volatility. So I'm going to leave it at that. I want to thank you all for coming. Next week, I am doing a webinar on Maple finances, and then 2 weeks out, Chris Lindgren, or 3 weeks out, Chris Lindgren on SAP Enterprises. And wish you all the best. Have a good evening.